Hi all, thanks for joining us today. My name is Michaela Campbell, and I am the Director of Government Affairs for the Congressional Fire Services Institute. As many of you know, CFSI is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that works to educate the federal government on the needs of the fire and emergency services. CFSI's strength comes from our partnership with many of the organizations on our National Advisory Committee, and I am so pleased to be joined by representatives from 4 of those organizations today. Each of these individuals plays a huge role in advocating for the fire and emergency services on Capitol Hill and beyond. So here today to discuss the ins and outs of federal advocacy are Ken LaSala, Director of Government Relations and Policy for the International Association of Fire Chiefs, Shannon Meissner, Director of Governmental Affairs for the International Association of Firefighters, Seth Statler, Director of Government Affairs at the National Fire Protection Association, and Dave Finger, Chief of Legislative and Regulatory Affairs at the National Volunteer Fire Council. So thank you all for being here today. Dave, let's start by talking about the members of Congress, senators and representatives. We just had elections a few months ago that resulted in a new president and several new members of Congress and changed the party controlling the Senate. Can you give us an assessment of the 2020 elections and what that means for the Senate and the House of Representatives, as well as sort of the legislative process overall?
Sure. I think there are 2 main results from the 2020 elections that have impacted the way policymaking in DC operates. So the first is that we have unified control of both houses of Congress and the White House. That means that one party, in this case, the Democrats, control the House, the Senate, and the White House. So as long as all the Democrats agree on a particular policy or bill, it's sometimes possible for them to enact it without Republican support. And you can see this in the approach that Democrats took to passing COVID relief legislation earlier this year, which was enacted without any support from Republicans. The other main result of the 2020 election was that the margins by which Democrats control the House and the Senate are extremely small. They only have a 7-vote majority in the House currently, and the Senate is 50-50, with Vice President Harris giving Democrats the majority by casting a tie-breaking vote. So that means Democrats have very little margin for losing votes if they want to pass something on a party line vote. It also means that getting legislation passed in the Senate, where most types of bills require at least 60 votes to be brought up for consideration, will require significant Republican support. So I think those are kind of the 2 broad overarching takeaways from the election that I had.
Thanks, Dave. So as you mentioned, the margins are smaller and that can make it more difficult to pass legislation. So can you expound upon that a little bit in terms of the legislative process? Obviously, it's very complicated, and in many cases, it's not particularly linear. And this is definitely a topic that could be its own panel. But can you give us sort of the basic high-level look at the process?
You mean like how a bill becomes a law?
Exactly. How a bill becomes a law. Cliff Notes version.
Sure. So, essentially a bill gets introduced, it gets referred to 1 or more committees. Those committees will then take action on the bill, modify it, pass it. After it passes out of committee, it'll go to either the full House or the full Senate. The full House or the full Senate will vote on the bill. Then it goes over to the other chamber. And that process goes back and forth the same way until the bill passes in the exact same fashion in both the House and the Senate. It goes to the president. The president can sign it into law. The president can also veto it. So in theory, that's how it works. And we could probably do a whole show on the legislative process and how it actually works. But one important facet that I think is important for people to understand is a lot of bills get introduced and they don't go anywhere, or they get introduced and maybe the committee takes it up, but it doesn't actually go through the full House or the Senate. What often happens is the bill gets introduced, the committee takes a look at it, and then at the end of the year, there's this one big bill that passes and everybody tries to hang their little bills onto it. So, the actual way that things are supposed to function don't necessarily always work that way.
Thanks, Dave. That's a great point, and certainly one that I think we have all faced. So talking now about the members of Congress themselves. So out of all of the members in Congress, how do you know which are your representatives, your senators and your congressmen and women? And then beyond that, what types of information should you know about them and how can you find it? Shannon, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Michaela. Well, the good news is it's really easy to know who your elected federal representatives are. Every person has 2 senators that represent them, and those are by the state. Each state has 2 senators, and then everyone has 1 representative serving in the U.S. House of Representatives that serves as their congressman. And so you can learn who this is based on where you live. The U.S. House of Representatives actually has a website that we will post in the chat here, that if you don't know who your representative is, you can type in your zip code and learn who that is. As far as what you need to know about your member of Congress, if you have a meeting with the member, it's generally good to know their perspective, if you can, on the issue that you're discussing. Have they ever supported this type of issue in the past? What is their general perspective on these types of issues? If you're talking to them about tax policy, if you're talking to them about fire service issues. Some other things you might like to know are, what party are they affiliated with? Are they a Democrat? Are they a Republican? Do they serve on a committee at which this issue might be brought up? But really, at the end of the day, it's okay if you don't know that much about the member of Congress. They care more about your perspective because you are their constituent. And it's far more important to know about the issue that you're speaking to them on. And as members of the fire service and EMS community, you're all experts in the issues that you're going to be talking to your members of Congress about. So you're really the majority of the way there already.
Thanks, Shannon. And that's a great point. It is, while it can be helpful to know about your member of Congress, the fact that when you're going to Congress, you're bringing your own expertise is certainly a particularly important point. But to the extent that you do want to know more about your members, as Shannon mentioned, that a lot of that information can be found online. Once you figure out who they are, they've got their websites where you can find, as Shannon said, the committee affiliations, caucus affiliations, etc. So moving actually towards the topic of caucuses, the Fire Caucus is one of the largest caucuses on Capitol Hill. Seth, can you talk a little bit about the caucus and why it's important to have members of Congress on the caucus?
Absolutely, Michaela, and thanks for the chance to be here with everybody today. The Fire Caucus is an amazing tool for first responders to carry their message to members of Congress and to the staff, who are another important audience that we all need to focus on reaching. Caucus was formed back in 1987, before any of us were involved in doing the work that we're doing today. But just to think back in history for a minute, at that point, every fire service organization would approach members of Congress and staff individually with their priorities, many of which were similar, but maybe not quite the same. And it was a confusing array of different organizations. And there was a decision made to unify in 1987 and work together, when we can, which is much, if not all of the time, and to carry one message. And the Fire Caucus has done an amazing job doing that. The great staff at the caucus, like you, Michaela, do such a good job with this. And it should be the largest caucus. I mean, what's more important than supporting the fire and emergency services personnel around this country? I think currently we have, I think the latest count is about 208 members. It should be double that. And all of you on this call can play a role with that. Make sure that your members, both the 2 senators that Shannon talked about and your representative, are members of the caucus. Some members have excuses why they don't want to join a caucus, or they already are a member of too many. Just keep pushing them politely. Tell them how important it is to join this caucus, and reach out to other members in your state. Work with other fire personnel around your state, and see if you can't get the entire state delegation to be a member of the caucus. I've worked with the caucus both as a congressional staffer and as a member of the staff of one of the key fire organizations, and I just can tell you, it's such an effective voice. And so we've got to keep that status as one of the largest caucuses, and all of you can be a big help on that.
Thanks, Seth. So, follow-up question for you. Why is it helpful to have a member who's on the Fire Services Caucus? So when you're going and chatting with them, does that give you an extra talking point? Does it help sort of relate legislation that you might be bringing to them or policy ideas? Can you expound on that a little bit?
Well, for one thing, it means they're going to be getting more frequent communications from Michaela, you, and the other members of the staff. It also is demonstrating their interest in fire service issues. It means they're going to have a staff dedicated to that caucus, probably along with a long list of other issues. But when a member joins a caucus, they're going to assign somebody on their team to work on those issues. And so I just think it helps to bring the important issues that we all deal with a little bit higher up on the priority list. And can I just add that if your member already is a member of the Fire Caucus, be sure to thank them and give them credit for that, whenever you can, because they deserve your thanks for jumping in and supporting the Fire Caucus.
Thanks, Seth. Yeah, that's a great explanation, and I think it can certainly be helpful when members are on the caucus. So moving now to the broader workings of Congress. So as David mentioned earlier, not every bill that gets introduced becomes a law. And in the last Congress, there were about 20,000 bills introduced, and there were around 400 that became law. So it's important to note, as David mentioned, that not every bill that's introduced is expected to become law, but what makes the difference for bills that pass successfully? Ken, can you talk about this a little bit?
Sure. Thanks, Michaela. Yeah, just a couple of things to think about. First, it's really helpful if the bill is bipartisan, especially in the Senate with that 50-50 split. But the need, for the most part, to get 60 votes to pass something in the Senate, it's really helpful if we can have bills that have both Republican and Democratic support. Two, getting on some of the things that were discussed earlier, it's important that the bill be relevant to larger must-pass legislation. For example, the Assistance to Firefighters Grant Program and the SAFER Grant Program were both included with the annual Defense Authorization Bill. So the fact that we were able to get those programs added to bills that have to pass every year, once the amendment was added, it made it easier for our proposal to actually become law. So that was actually really great. And then we've had some good luck over the past couple of years with these, COVID-19 funding, adding that to like the CARES Act and things like that. The other thing, it should be important to be easy for the members to explain why they support the legislation to the public. Obviously, fire and emergency services legislation, generally the public supports fire departments and EMS departments, and things that are good for the local fire service. It's easy for your member of Congress to go back home and hold an event at the local fire department and say, hey, I'm really glad I support this legislation. So again, that's another good reason for why a bill becomes law. And then the final thing is it has to have the support of the public and stakeholders. So example, most members of Congress want to support fire service legislation that's supported by all of our groups. In addition, they like to hear from their local fire and EMS chiefs, their local firefighters, EMS personnel. So that's where you all come in as the grassroots. It's really great if you all can reach out to your members of Congress, like we're talking about today, and say to support our legislative agenda, because then the members will know that they have both national fire service support and their local fire chief, local firefighters, local EMS folks, local volunteers support this legislation. So, with those type of characteristics, usually it makes it easier for a bill to pass. But like you said, like nothing's guaranteed.
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, I think so. One of the themes it sounds like that you're bringing to the forefront is that building support and making those connections with people, with other policy items, with other policy agendas, et cetera, is critical to helping bills move forward in the process. So one of the things that I hear, I think, when I'm chatting with people about being in DC, working in DC, interacting with the Hill federal government, et cetera, is sometimes people will say to me that they would get involved in advocacy, in grassroots, et cetera, but given that their members of Congress are frequently in DC and they might live elsewhere, sometimes it can feel particularly remote. So I think sometimes people are questioning whether there's some disenfranchisement or whether their voice would matter when you're reaching out to these members of Congress. So Dave, can you talk a little bit about the role that individuals can play in federal advocacy and how, frequently it is actually vital to building support?
Sure. And I can certainly understand why people might see DC as being remote and wonder why their voice counts or whether it counts. I think there are two kind of main areas that or reasons the congressional offices really do care about what folks outside of DC have to say. And the first is simply wanting to help their constituents. That's what members of Congress are elected to do. And in theory, the more they do to help their constituents, the better their chances of being reelected. Building relationships, building goodwill is definitely a two-way street for members of Congress and their constituents. I can tell you every member of Congress I've interacted with, that just comes through. They want you to like them. And on the back of their mind, it's because they want to get reelected. We had a Senate election in Maine last year where Susan Collins, a Republican, rather easily defeated a well-funded challenger in spite of the fact that President Biden, a Democrat, carried Maine. And Collins had built up enough goodwill among her constituents that she was able to overcome some pretty strong political headwinds. Collins, a current Fire Caucus co-chair, Biden, a past Fire Caucus co-chair. But, you see in successful politicians that they want to help their constituents, and, that's why they're going to listen to you. The other reason they're going to listen to you, and where you can really bring a lot of value to these interactions with your elected officials, is your knowledge and expertise. Again, elected officials want to help you, but it's up to you to tell them what you need and why you need it so they can do a good job fighting for you. You're the subject matter expert on what your fire department needs. And there's a lot of power in that. If you can make a persuasive case to an elected official for why your department would benefit from a particular policy, what impact it's going to make, that's going to make their job easier, because then they can go to the people that they serve on committees with, and they can make the same case that you're making to them. If you go and you tell them what you need and you don't make a very persuasive case, it may not be that they don't want to help you. It may be that they just don't see a path forward for what you're asking them to do. So, help them help you, I guess, would be my message.
So thanks, Dave, for that summary on, why it's important to get involved and really why it is beneficial. And it's a two-way street with members of Congress. You might be looking to them to make certain policy issues move forward, but they're also looking to you to get that information and to learn how they can be helpful to you. So another comment sometimes I hear from folks when I'm talking about federal advocacy is that they could get involved, but sometimes they just don't see the value, or they're wondering, what the federal politics really has to do with them locally. Shannon, can you talk a little bit about why national policy can matter at the local level?
Yeah, sure, Michaela. I think folks are often really surprised at how much of an impact the federal government has on the fire service. But really, all corners of the federal government do have an impact in some way, shape, or form. Whether you're talking about federal funding for programs that may help fund your fire department, such as the Fire and Safer grant programs, which everyone here knows well, or funding for hazardous materials training, or setting policies that impact wildland firefighting, or tax policies that can impact how you are funded at the local level. There's a lot that the federal government does that impact how firefighters do their jobs, their health and well-being, and their economic safety and security. Two recent examples that I think will really shed a good light on this is the recently passed COVID package in the House, the American Rescue Plan Act, which contained significant funding and benefits for firefighters and the fire service, including additional funding for the Safer and Fire grant programs, funding for state and local governments to assist local fire departments overcome the economic downturn that was experienced over the past year, tax credits to incentivize local governments to provide emergency sick and emergency paid FMLA leave for their professional firefighters, as well as other benefits for the fire service, including mental health benefits, presumptive workman's comp benefits for federal firefighters who contract COVID, and the list goes on and on. That is something that Congress has been working on for several months now, and it has a direct impact on the lives of fire service and EMS members throughout the country. The other recent example that has an impact on our members' lives directly that I'd like to bring up is the legislation which was passed last year to establish a PSOB benefit for firefighters who contracted COVID. The PSOB program is a death and disability benefit for public safety officers. And prior to the passage of this law, if a firefighter died of COVID, they would need to prove that they contracted it on the job. Congress passed legislation with the help of all of the organizations on this call to ensure that no firefighter needs to make that proof, make that connection in order for their families to receive that benefit. So the federal government really does have a very, the federal government really does make an impact on the day-to-day lives of our firefighters and EMS personnel.
So hopefully we have now convinced everyone in the audience that there is a role for you in advocacy at the federal level and that it is an important role. So let's talk about how people can get involved. Seth, if you're interested in getting involved, you're thinking you might be interested in getting involved, where do you start?
Well, we do need people to get involved, and I think I would sum it up in two phrases. One, be informed, and two, be vocal. And there are lots of great resources from the organizations represented on this call that can help you be informed. CFSI has a lot of great information on their website. You can actually see the policy positions that the CFSI National Advisory Committee has taken on a lot of issues. I get lots of great information from the IFC, IAFF, and NBFC websites on issues that are both major issues and minor issues. There's just a ton of good information that I think can help us all learn. A good example I'll cite from NFPA is we have just launched a major policy initiative to try to reduce and hopefully eventually eliminate the destruction of communities from wildfire. We call it Outthink Wildfire. We think it's going to take probably about 30 years for this country to really move through all the recommendations that we have as part of this program. But you can view all of those. You know, they're divided into 5 major policy planks. A lot of them are things we're going to be talking to federal officials about. Some of them are things we're going to be talking with state officials around the country about. And some of them are things that you and your local community can take action on or talk to local officials about. So it's just a good example of the type of information you can find on all of the websites here. So be informed, but then be vocal. You know, as Dave was saying, we need to speak up and ever so politely and professionally, you know, talk to the folks that represent us. I can tell you that without question, they would rather hear from you in their local community, in their district that they represent, than they would from those of us who are considered the inside the beltway types. You know, we can always provide the detail, but the angst and the urgency for action comes from talking to people in the local states and in the local congressional districts. So, you know, use the information that you get to talk to folks, build relationships with them. You know, don't wait until there's some problem or some, you know, pending vote. You know, the time to reach out to your member of Congress and the other elected officials is now. You know, invite them to the firehouse, invite them to a meeting. You know, even at my firehouse in Maryland, we invite the mayor over. Our congressman has been there a number of times. You know, sure, if we were to get an AFG grant, we would want to, you know, invite the local delegation to come help celebrate that. But we don't want to wait until that has happened to build that relationship. So build those relationships, share your views, do it politely. We've all had enough of impolite political discourse in this country. And I think to the extent we can be informed and be vocal, we can be very effective in influencing what the Congress does.
So quick follow-up for you on that, Seth. So you mentioned that, well, first of all, I think it's great, the idea to make a friend before you need a friend and start building those relationships now can be really important in how that relationship develops, particularly if you're able to share a lot of positive things right off the bat. So you had mentioned maybe some sort of site visits, et cetera, and interacting with the district offices. Can you explain a little bit about what a district office is?
Absolutely, Michaela. It's a great point to follow up on, because members of Congress have policy staffs that work in Washington, and they're very critical people, but they also all have staffs in their local communities. And those are the folks who might be a little bit easier to reach. They also have a big role in setting the agenda for your local congressmen and your senators. And it's just a great opportunity to invite them to stop by the firehouse, invite them to play in your golf tournament, invite them to stop by your annual awards banquet, and build relationships. Let them see how hardworking the members of your department are, because we all know about the fire service, and we all know what the issues are. But these staff are dealing with many issues, and it's just helpful for them to see firsthand. Invite them to go for a ride along if your department policies allow that. That's something that they'll never forget, and it will give them a firsthand opportunity to see that not everybody's sleeping from midnight till 8 in the morning. And it just helps you build that rapport that you're going to need when it's time to ask them to support legislation that's moving.
And this actually ties in pretty well with my next question, which is regarding interaction with legislators. So one of the fastest and easiest ways to interact with legislators is to email them. So how can you find their contact page, and what are some things to think about in terms of content or just general context as you're crafting your email? Ken, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Sure. Thanks, Michaela. So basically, like Seth was saying, the best thing to do really is try to meet with your members of Congress and the appropriate staff in person. Sometimes, though, that's not possible. You've got a lot of stuff going on. You don't have time to set a meeting at the district office. A bill is moving very quickly through Congress, et cetera. So one of the easiest things to do, like you mentioned, is just to email the member of Congress. There's a couple of things you can do. The easiest actually is to go to the member's website. Usually there's an icon in the top of the screen that says contact us or contact me. And then what you can do is just go to that page, and you end up just putting in your name, title, address information, sometimes phone number, sometimes not, but email. And the big thing is the address is important because they want to make sure that you're really one of their constituents. And then there'll be like a little text box, and that's where you put in your message. And for your message, I guess a couple of quick things. First, make sure that it's focused really on one topic, because you don't have a lot of space to talk about. Two, kind of keep it focused on what it is that you want the member of Congress to do. Make sure you've got some good reasoning. And then finally, make sure you've got a personal reason for why you're asking the member of Congress to support something. So for example, if you're writing to your member of Congress about supporting the AFG or SAFER grant programs, talk about how those programs have actually helped your department. Have they hired people? Have you gotten new equipment? Can you now provide hazmat capability to your jurisdiction? These types of things are really important, and the staff end up having to read all these, and they really care about it. And that's really great examples that they can use to go back and educate the actual member of Congress. So something you put in a letter sometimes actually may end up being used as an example there on the House or Senate floor. So that's really great. The other thing too is all of our organizations have pages that you can go to either download talking points or pre-written letters, which makes your life a lot easier. And in some cases too, you can actually click through our sites to your member of Congress and your senators and just be able to send them each, one specific message that they can easily, take down and understand and move forward. So with email, there's a lot of opportunities. Also these days, you can also send members of Congress tweets and messages through Facebook. The only thing I'd always recommend, kind of like Seth was mentioning earlier, please make sure that you're polite, and stay on topic, and, just try to be respectful in today's political discourse. So thanks.
So I will preface this question by saying that the national organizations can be particularly helpful with these because in many cases, legislators like to meet with groups. But so talking about Hill meetings, whether you request a meeting yourself or you're asked to join a meeting, how does that work? What do you need to know? Dave, do you want to take this one?
So sometimes you'll meet with members of Congress and staff together, and sometimes you'll meet with just staff. It is not uncommon for a member of Congress to miss all or part of a scheduled meeting and for staff to pick up the slack in their absence. Don't let this throw you. Members of Congress typically have multiple overlapping appointments. That's just how it works, particularly when they're in DC. Another important piece of running a Hill meeting is be sure to have an agenda and prioritize your message points. Bring up the most important bill you want to talk about first, because you never know when the member of Congress you're meeting with will have to leave for a vote or another appointment. If you have a group, know who in your group is going to talk about what issues and try to stay on message. A little bit of back and forth conversation to establish rapport is great, but not if it comes at the expense of talking about the issues. And also, if you have a group, you want to make sure everybody gets a chance to talk. So you kind of need to plan out beforehand who's going to say what. Provide specific examples, data, or anecdotes to support your message. Remember, you're the subject matter expert on what you and your department need. Take advantage of that status by providing good information to back up your requests. The better the case you make to your elected representative, the better position they will be to advocate for you. Make your ask clearly and don't move on to a new topic until you get some sort of direct response. The ask is the action you want the elected official you are meeting with to take on your behalf. Could be co-sponsor a bill, co-sign a funding letter, call a federal agency, etc. If you don't have a clear ask, you aren't likely to get any direct action as a result of your meeting. Be a good listener, even if the elected official disagrees with aspects of your position. You aren't going to win everybody over on every issue. Do your best to convince them, but don't get bogged down. This is an important one and maybe a little counterintuitive, but when you don't know the answer to a question, admit it and promise to do some research and get back to the elected official with an answer. Also, take notes so that you can follow up on any commitments or questions that arise. It may seem like in the meeting, everything's going to be very vivid in your memory, but after 5 or 6 meetings in one day, you're going to be confused about who said what, who committed to do what. It's really important to have good notes. After a good meeting, there will probably be at least as many issues that remain to be worked out as issues where you got a commitment one way or another. So the end of the meeting really shouldn't be the end of your interaction with the elected official. Finally, send a thank you note after the meeting. It's a nice touch that will help a member of Congress and their staff remember you the next time you need to contact them about something.
But now that we've talked a little bit about email and Hill meetings themselves, let's talk a little bit about communication more broadly. So having a unified message is vital, whether that message is being delivered by a coalition, by individual organizations, or by individuals themselves. Why is having one message so important though? And how can individuals who are looking to get involved make sure that they stay on message and sort of help to further the drumbeat as opposed to maybe moving off in one course or another? Seth, do you want to expound on that a little?
Sure, I'm happy to. And actually, I think part of this answer is what I mentioned earlier, that, if every fire organization, every fire service organization tried to talk individually to a member's office, it would be somewhat overwhelming. And, we know that within the kind of the broader CFSI community, there's about 40 organizations. And, it's difficult for the staff to keep up with all the different nuances. And so the real advantage that CFSI brings is that it's a chance for those organizations to come together and to join together on a unified message whenever we can. And when, in those few instances where maybe we can't, we still understand and respect each other's differences on issues. But in the large majority of cases, the fire service comes together through CFSI. And so you have those talking points. You can find them sometimes on the CFSI website in the form of resolutions, in the form of other communications that the caucus may put out. As was mentioned, you can often find them on the website for the different organizations on here. And so, to the extent that we use those and hit the same message over and over again, it reinforces the unity of the fire service, and it reinforces to the members of Congress and the staff what we're trying to do. And the power of us working together is just absolutely incredible. When you look at the extra resources and support that as a team we were able to push for in the early days of the pandemic and throughout the pandemic, when you look at the portable gas flame arrestor bill that finally passed after years of folks being concerned about that danger, and when you look at the fire sprinkler retrofit grants, it took 15 years of the fire service working together to push for that small but important change to the tax code. And if we had not worked together on it, it would still not be done. And so I think that shows you the great power of us all working together. The big investments that the Congress has made in AFG and SAFER grants, I think, again, is because we speak with a unified voice. And CFSI is just so important to that. So I encourage you, to stay involved with all of us, but particularly with CFSI. Think about joining CFSI. Their Associates Club is a very small way to help financially with the great work that the caucus and the Institute do.
So talking a little bit more about, you're thinking about getting involved and you're thinking about maybe sending an email or taking some meetings, and you're looking up some information on your members of Congress, and you find that their party affiliation is different from one that you yourself are affiliated with. So Ken, can you talk a little bit about, what do you think about in that situation, and, why can it still be important to develop and maintain those relationships?
Sure. Well, the good news is fire and EMS issues are nonpartisan. So in most cases, members of Congress really support the fire and emergency service. So I would definitely urge as much as possible to talk to anybody who happens to be your senator or your member of Congress about these issues, especially if you're coming to DC. It's definitely worthwhile to try to meet with them. Like I mentioned earlier, the House right now is, sorry, not the House, the Senate is a 50-50 split. And it's important to have both Republican and Democratic support for legislation in order to get it through the Senate. And in the House too, it's very helpful to get bills out of committees if they have both Republican and Democratic support. So it's always good to be able to talk to both your Republican and Democratic members of Congress. And like I said earlier, they usually end up supporting, fire and EMS issues. Basically, as much as possible, try to build up bipartisan support, and that's the easiest way to get your bills passed.
So now that we've kind of had this conversation about why you should get involved, how you can get involved, let's try to put it all together a little bit. So the Firefighter Cancer Registry Act passed in 2018, became law, and I feel like that's a really good example to illustrate the importance of advocacy in the legislative process. Shannon, can you talk a little bit about that bill and sort of the process for how it became law?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this bill passing the Firefighter Cancer Registry Act was really, I think, one of the preeminent achievements that all the organizations on this call have had in the past several years. But every bill starts with an idea, and the Firefighter Cancer Registry Act was no different. But we all have been talking about cancer in the fire service amongst ourselves and in our organizations for years before this bill was ever written. right? And in so doing, we identified some problems that the bill was meant to address, namely that we knew cancer was a problem in the fire service. We knew it was a big problem in the fire service. And we knew there was research out there that connected cancer to firefighting, but some of the details in between were a little bit more fuzzy, right? What is it about your service as a firefighter that causes you to have a higher risk of developing these specific cancers? Is it related to toxins in your environment? Is it related to your operational procedures? Is it related to diesel exhaust that you're exposed to every day? Is it some combination of all these things? What is it exactly? And so the Firefighter Cancer Registry Act grew out of those questions and grew out of a need to better understand the problem of cancer in the fire service. And so together, the National Fire Service organizations approached our friends on Capitol Hill and suggested that developing a registry would help us resolve some of these issues. Earlier in the conversation, Ken mentioned that having a unified voice was key to accomplishing so much on Capitol Hill. And that was exactly the case with the Firefighter Cancer Registry Act. Volunteers, career, management, codes and standards, we were all united in our message. And we were able to approach our friends on Capitol Hill in a united fashion. And that was really key to getting the support that was necessary to get it passed. So together, we worked to build support on Capitol Hill. We utilized our members, all of our organizations spoke to our members about this problem, spoke to our members about this bill, encouraged them to get out and really do the grassroots work of building co-sponsors, building support for the bill in a bipartisan fashion in both chambers of Congress, the House and the Senate. And that building that broad support, demonstrating that broad support really allowed the national organizations to then go in behind our grassroots and talk to the committees of jurisdiction and talk to the leadership in each chamber and allowed us to move the bill. So it was really just a matter of constant conversation amongst the National Fire Service organizations and its members and members of Congress on the Hill to build that support and allow us to be able to get it through the legislative process.
Can you talk a little bit about when you say grassroots, what does that mean?
Yeah, so when it's a term of art for us, but when we talk about the grassroots, we're really talking about a member of Congress's constituents, right? We're talking about each of you, members of the different National Fire Service organizations at whatever level that is. We are talking about folks who serve in their communities on a day-to-day basis, and our constituents are the member of Congress that are able to bring that real-world perspective, real-life perspective to the members of Congress and say, hey, I'm your constituent. This is how this bill impacts me. So when we utilize our members, people on the ground who have that lived experience, that's what we mean when we say grassroots. And as was mentioned earlier, grassroots voices have a lot of power, often more power than any of us hired hands do.
So let's say that somebody gets a call for grassroots outreach from one of the organizations on this panel. Who can respond to those? You know, are you only looking for fire chiefs, for department leaders? Are you looking for everybody? What's the takeaway with that?
No, I would say that if you have an experience to share, if you have an opinion on the issue, we want to hear your voice, and we want you to share your voice with a member of Congress. The member of Congress really doesn't care if you are day one on the job, or if you're the fire chief of your department, or if you're a retired guy who's telling war stories down at the hall. They want to know your lived experience. They want to know how their constituents feel. And so no matter what point you are at in your career in the fire service, or what your relationship to the fire service may be, your voice is valuable to the conversation.
Thanks, Shannon. So based on your experiences in advocacy or in lobbying, what would be a top tip or a top advocacy tip? And I think one thing that springs to mind for me is being authentic and sharing that lived experience. So, it is important for members of Congress to hear your perspective. And I think that that's something that can sometimes be lost in the policy conversation. So I guess starting with Shannon and going down the panel, what would be a top tip maybe that you would share?
Yeah, my number one top tip is personal example. If you are lobbying on a particular issue, think about how that issue has impacted your life. For example, if you're lobbying on a bill that would reduce cancer in the fire service, and one of your brothers or sisters at your department has recently contracted cancer, sharing that story is important to do. If you are lobbying on funding for training or apparatus or new equipment, and you're currently short that equipment at your department, sharing that specific example is important to do. So always reflect on the issue at hand and how it impacts you or your brothers and sisters, and share those personal experiences.
Thanks, Shannon. Ken, do you want to go next?
Sure. Basically stay focused, know what you want to say, come in, say what you have to say. Like Shannon was saying, personalize it, and then be polite and keep moving. Those guys have a really busy day. There's a lot of stuff going on. And the more you can stay focused and cogent, the more they'll appreciate it and really take your advice to heart.
Thanks, Ken. That's a great point. Seth, want to share your piece of advice?
Well, Ken just raised a really important one, and that's to be concise, to not take a inordinate amount of time with these busy folks. But I think the other thing I would advise is, if possible, leave something in writing that kind of explains your issues. Again, very concise. You can often pull this off of any of the websites that we've talked about here. But for one thing, if you walk into the room with like a one-pager or half-pager on an issue, then the staff can focus on listening to you as opposed to trying to take notes. But it also just allows them, if they want to talk to a member of Congress or to other staff or whoever, it allows them to have the accurate information right there in front of them. And you're kind of basically helping them do some of their work. So I always try to have a brief but informative leave behind.
So I guess my top tip would be for folks to build relationships with staff in congressional offices. If you meet with a member of Congress and you meet with the staff person, most of your follow-up communication is going to be with the staff person. And, sending them emails, maybe calling them occasionally. You don't want to pester them, but get to know them and become a resource for them if they have questions. You want to be in a position where when something comes up related to fire and emergency services and they need a question answered, that they go to you for that. So, cultivate those relationships. When they give you their cards at the end of the meetings, use that information for follow-up and really build those relationships because they're important.
Well, before we head to the Q&A portion of this panel, I just want to say a big thank you to everyone on this panel for taking the time to be with us today and to share your experience. And I also, for the folks in the audience, just want to reiterate that, as has been mentioned several times, the websites can be a great resource for the House, for the Senate, also in terms of policy information, the organizations on this panel. If you have any questions about how to get involved, feel free to email update@cfsi.org, and we're happy to make sure that any questions you have get distributed out to the folks. And with that, thanks everybody, and we'll head over to the Q&A portion.